As you can tell by the title, today's video is the most haunted cemeteries in Georgia. This video was recommended by Chris. He picked another one because we can't decide for ourselves, and if you want to see a cemetery video, if you want to see a most haunted cemeteries video, let us know what location to do and we will do it, because we don't pick for ourselves because that's very overwhelming.
Like for the urban legends, I think we've both like picked one and that's it.
We just can't make decisions. Well, it's
we're gonna have a long day.
Most haunted cemeteries in Georgia. Savannah, Georgia is famous for being Georgia's first city. It is also famous for its haunted history and legends of ghosts. So of course we have to start here. The first cemetery on this list is Colonial Park Cemetery. Opening in 1750, it is the oldest burial ground in Savannah. There are very few burial grounds that were used prior to 1750, but they have mostly been paved over and had buildings built on top of them. This has caused Savannah to get the title, the city that lives upon her dead. Colonial Park Cemetery is made up of 6 acres with over 10,000 people buried within that land. But there are not even 1,000 headstones on this property. Many were buried in mass graves, and others have even had their grave markers knocked down or destroyed. With that sad and destructive news, it causes many to believe that it helps fuel the paranormal activity that is said to happen in the cemetery. It is said that Colonial Park Cemetery is one of the most haunted places in all of Savannah, which is a pretty high title since everywhere seems to be haunted. People who have taken tours here have seen shadowy figures wandering among the graves, and some have even seen a green mist floating throughout the cemetery. The most famous ghost story surrounding this cemetery is the story of René Rondelier. He was born in 1777 in Colonial Savannah. While living, René was a very tall person, almost 7 feet tall. He enjoyed torturing and killing the neighborhood animals. It got to the point they asked his parents to step in. His parents confined him to their property, which bordered Colonial Park Cemetery's east wall. They built a 7 to 8 foot high brick wall to keep René from climbing over. One night, René escaped and murdered 2 young girls in the cemetery. Not long after, he was caught hiding deep inside the cemetery. There was a mob organized to find and lynch him. René was hung in the nearby square and then buried on his family's land. Soon after, residents started noticing a large shadow figure walking the grounds of the cemetery, and they knew it was the ghost of René Rondelier. As I said at the beginning, this is one of the most famous ghost stories of Colonial Park Cemetery. And that's all it is, a story. There is no evidence of René Rondelier in historical records, as he simply did not exist. Nobody has ever been able to find the records of the little girls who were supposedly murdered by René. Now that I've just told you a fictional ghost story, let's move on to something spooky that is true. And yes, this is true. For a long period of time, Savannah has had a popular voodoo culture. Many voodoo practitioners live in and around the area. Colonial Park Cemetery used to not be closed at night. The next day, cemetery visitors would find evidence of a voodoo ceremony that had been performed the previous night. The soil from the graves would appear to be used in some rituals, and sometimes the graves were even dug into to get human bones. A notable burial in Colonial Park is that of Major General Nathaniel Greene. He is known for being second in command to General George Washington during the Revolutionary War. He is also known for having his body lost. On June 19, 1786, Greene died from heat stroke on his plantation Mulberry Grove, which was on the outskirts of Savannah. The next day, his body was transported by boat to Savannah. Later that afternoon, his body was taken to the cemetery for burial. His body was going to be placed in the Graham family vault. The Graham family wasn't using it since they had fled the country. A few years later, the vault was opened again for his son, George Washington Greene. He died when his boat overturned near Mulberry Grove. On April 4th, 1870, he was put in the vault. It took 30 years for Savannah to lose the bodies. In 1901, Asa Bird, president of the Rhode Island Society of Cincinnati, came to Savannah to track down the bodies. While inspecting family vaults in the cemetery, they found the two in the Graham Mossman family vault. In 1902, Nathaniel and his son were moved to their final resting place in Johnson Square in Savannah. Going back in history a few hundred years, Savannah had a devastating time with yellow fever. The disease, which is caused by being bit by an infected mosquito, ravaged the area more than once. 1820 was one of the worst years for Savannah. In Colonial Park, at the northern end, there is a mass grave that holds almost 700 bodies of people who lost their lives during the epidemic. One rumor is that the exact number of bodies in this mass grave is 666, although this has never been proven. With all of this history, it's no wonder there is some paranormal activity occurring. Another popular ghost sighting, and one that has been caught on camera, is that of the Jumping Boy. In December 2008, a teen named Jesse Greathouse was visiting from Ohio and was taking a walk through the cemetery with a video camera. While recording, he captured a small child chasing after somebody inside the cemetery. The boy jumps straight up into a tree way above his head and then jumps down the same tree a few moments later. Some have debunked this video, but let me know what you think.
Heading to Saute in northeast Georgia, there's a church and a cemetery that sits on 6 acres of land on the northern slopes of Nacoochee Valley. Started in 1833 by Major Edward Williams, the Nacoochee United Methodist Cemetery is the final resting place of early settlers and their slaves who arrived in Dukes Creek and Nacoochee and Saute Valley area in the 1820s. There are some unmarked graves that could be even older than the 1820s, but nobody knows how much older. In this cemetery there are over 700 graves. The most well-known spirit here is that of a little girl. After her funeral and burial, her father built a dollhouse over top of her grave to protect her from the rain. There is a legend that says the man who killed her was hung from a tree in the cemetery, and if you stay by her grave for a while, you can hear her start crying.
Traveling a little under 2 hours south from Saute, Nacoochee to Atlanta, Georgia, we come to Oakland Cemetery. This cemetery was founded in 1850 and is Atlanta's largest and oldest cemetery. Before it was Oakland, the cemetery was called Atlanta Cemetery and sat on 6 acres of land. The common number here seems to be 6 acres. It was originally located right outside city limits. The first burial was a doctor named James Nissen. Allegedly, James had a fear of being buried alive. Because of this fear, he requested that his jugular be severed prior to his burial to make him less anxious. His request was granted. Over the following years, Atlanta grew immensely and was surrounding the cemetery. The cemetery also grew, with new acres being added every year, and the land was filling with graves and crypts. By 1872, the cemetery was renamed Oakland because of all the oak and magnolia trees planted in the area. Atlanta had a significant involvement in the Civil War, and because of that, city associations started sectioning off cemetery plots in tribute to fallen Confederate soldiers. There is a massive stone lion called the Lion of the Confederacy. The lion lays on top of a stone slab with its eyes closed, looking as if it is sleeping, watching over a field of over 3,000 unknown Confederate soldiers. Wrapped in the lion's paws and under its head like a pillow is a carved Confederate flag. Out of the 3,000 unmarked graves, 16 of them are the final resting place of Union soldiers. There is also a monument known as the Confederate Obelisk. During the war, Atlanta was a major medical and transportation center for the Confederacy and had many military hospitals. Hundreds of soldiers lost their lives in these hospitals and were buried at Oakland. The obelisk is carved from granite from Georgia's Stone Monument. It was once the tallest structure in the city, standing 65 feet tall. This monument was dedicated on April 26, 1874, on the anniversary of Joseph Johnston's surrender to Union General William Sherman. Atlanta also had more dark history that is represented here at Oakland. There is a black section of the cemetery from the height of segregation in America. A noticeable and sad feature to this section is the lack of headstones or any other type of grave marker. Back then, The cost of nice headstones was too expensive for families, so they could only afford wood and other cheap material that would eventually wear away and deteriorate due to weather. Over the recent years, Atlanta has taken steps to fix its past. They have taken Atlanta's first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, and buried him in the original 6 acres of land. Others they have done this to are Antoine Graves, principal of the first black school in Atlanta, and Reverend Frank Quarles, an early benefactor of the historically black Morehouse College. Now, many believe that because of all the historical tension in the cemetery has caused heightened tension in the afterlife. Experts think that due to Oakland's practice of burying the Union soldiers among the Confederate soldiers in the same field has caused unrest for the deceased. One man who had a spooky encounter can attest to this theory. This is how it went. On a chilly evening in November, just before nightfall, the man came into Oakland. He was from up north, but in Atlanta for business, and had just finished his long workday. Some of his ancestors fought and died in the Civil War, so he wanted to get out and do some sightseeing, and possibly see if this was where his ancestors were buried. As soon as he entered the cemetery through the massive iron gates, he felt a chill run up his spine. As he made his way through the cemetery as night was progressing, he began to feel more and more discomforted. Once he found himself at the Confederate section of the cemetery, an uneasy feeling in his stomach started to intensify. He then noticed a thick fog had rolled in around the headstones out of nowhere. Looking around, he realized he was all alone. A strange creaking sound began. Freaked out, he looked up to see the ghostly, pale figure of a Union soldier hanging by a rope from the branches of a tall oak tree. The soldier's head was facing down and his hat was covering most of his face, so the man couldn't make out any distinguishable features. Somewhere in the distance, the man could hear what he described as a troop of soldiers shouting, and the drums of war thumping out an ominous rhythm. Right before he turned and ran, the man saw a glimpse of the name stitched into the soldier's uniform. It was his own. Another encounter from a visitor goes like this. There was a young man who lived in Atlanta his entire life. He had known that his ancestors were buried in Oakland, but he had never made the trip to go see them. Once he turned 18, his father decided it was time. So on his 18th birthday, they made the trip to Oakland. Almost to the Confederate section, the father got a phone call that he had to take. So the boy was left alone with the graves. Instantly, the boy began to have an uneasy feeling. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, waiting for his father to return. After a while, the boy gave up and started to wander aimlessly around the graves. While wandering, the wind picked up and there was an unseasonable chill in the air. From out of the sky, the boy heard a loud voice beginning to call out a list of names. After each name, another voice responded saying, "Here." He described the voices as coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He was frantically looking all around, but couldn't find any source of where the voices were coming from. Panicked, he started to run through the cemetery. Wherever he went, the voices followed. He ran past the lion monument, and he swore that the lion yawned right at him. Right as he reached the gates, he heard the voice of the commanding officer call out a name. It was his own name. He was so terrified he ran right out of the cemetery, tripping over himself and almost falling on the way out. On the outside, his father was there waiting for him. In hysterics, the boy told his father what he experienced, and once he finished, his father burst out laughing. Shocked, the boy looked at his father, and his father said that his dad played the same prank on him for his 18th birthday. But regardless of pulling pranks on your kids, this cemetery seems to have a restless spirit or two roaming around. Do you know how pissed I'd be if my dad did that to me?
Family tradition. In Harris County, Georgia, sits the town of Waverly Hall, which has a population of 800. That's not very many.
No, it's less than this town.
For real life. The cemetery here dates back to the 1800s. It's said some of the people who are laid to rest here don't seem to actually be at rest. One of the oldest graves here is that of Reverend Thomas Darley, who lived from 1760 to 1832. He was a Revolutionary War officer and a Methodist minister who founded many Methodist churches throughout South Carolina and Georgia. Even though it's not the biggest cemetery, it is still said to be pretty haunted. Paranormal investigators love coming to the cemetery to see if the legends are true and to see if any can capture it on camera. There have been reports of disembodied voices, unexplained cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Some have even seen ghostly apparitions wandering through the graves. A person had even claimed to have stepped out of their car and heard an inhuman screeching sound, followed by footsteps charging at him. One of the most famous legends is that of the Lady in White.
I feel like there's a lot of Lady in White legends all around here.
There's a bajillion of them. The legend says a woman who is dressed in a white gown is often seen wandering through the cemetery at night. Some like to believe that she is the ghost of a young woman who died under mysterious circumstances, while others think she is the spirit of a grieving widow who visits her husband's grave. Here is an account from a couple who was traveling to Lynette, Alabama. They decided to stop by this cemetery after reading about it online. With a digital camera, they took a few pictures right before dark and then left. As they were leaving, they both claimed to feel sick to their stomachs. The woman started scrolling through the pictures, and she started to become more distressed and asked her boyfriend to pull over so he could look at the pictures. Right as he was pulling over, all of the pictures on the camera disappeared. It wasn't just the pictures of the cemetery either, it was all of the pictures on the camera. They went to a CVS, and the lady who worked there said the memory card was bad. They got the memory card replaced, and once they were back in the car, the woman was visibly shaken up. He asked what was wrong, and she said the worker in the store was the same woman she saw in the pictures. Could this have been another sighting of the famous Lady in White that haunts this cemetery? You decide. Another popular legend here is that of the hanging tree. This tree is said to have been used to hang criminals long ago, and that the people who were hung in the tree still haunt the area. Some have reported seeing apparitions of hanged men swinging from the branches of the tree. Others say that when they're standing next to or near the tree, they feel a strong sense of unease.
I did it, Mom.
What would you do if you took a picture of a ghost and you went to like a store and you saw the same exact person?
I would leave promptly and lay in the road.
Lay in the road? Ending right back up where we started, in Savannah, of course. It's only right we end this video in the most haunted city in Georgia. In 1853, the Laurel Grove Cemetery was established on the west side of Savannah on a portion of the former Springfield Plantation. It was actually created after Colonial Park, the first cemetery we talked about, became too full for any more burials. Its name comes from the native laurel oak trees that once inhabited the area. Because of the time period, this cemetery does have a segregated burial ground. The north side was reserved for the whites, and the south side was reserved for the blacks. There's a few famous people buried here. The Girl Scouts founder Juliet Gordon Lowe, 24 different Savannah mayors, a U.S. Supreme Court justice, and more than 1,500 Confederate soldiers. For people who didn't exist in the segregation era, this cemetery is an example of just how separated things used to be. There are two separate entrances, and the difference in grave markers and headstones is apparent. The black cemeteries that featured African and voodoo symbolism were relocated to Laurel Grove and were forced to look more European. Root doctors used the ground as a space to do their spiritual rituals, which is one of the reasons why the cemetery is so haunted today. One account said they witnessed a disembodied hand reaching around a headstone. Many see several women in white dresses, which is a traditional Victorian burial attire since this cemetery was around in the Victorian era. While walking around the cemetery, it's not uncommon to hear footsteps behind you, as if someone or something is following you around, watching from a distance. There's a ghostly legend that dates back to the 1850s. The story goes that when a trolley would pass through the area, those who rode the trolley past the cemetery would always hear the sound of a small child crying. Even when there were no children around, the crying would still be heard. Workers on the trolley would claim to hear the crying sound every single day for years and years.
That's crazy.
I hope you enjoyed that video of the most haunted cemeteries in Georgia. Let us know if you want to do, no, we're doing it, not you.
Back off.
This is my video. Let us know if there's other cemeteries in Georgia that you want us to do, and we can do a part 2. We also have other playlists on this channel. We do serial killers, cults, urban legends.
We do. Serial killers? We do.
We cover serial killers. We cover urban legends, cults, most haunted places in states, most haunted... most haunted cemeteries in states, and we have a bunch of bonus videos if you want to see us be stupid and get a good laugh in, while after we talk about all this serious stuff, you might need a good chuckle. Haha.
I knew you were gonna do that.
And like and comment and subscribe, and we will see you next time. I love how you duck.
It's because you can see it better in the door. See?
But you could also just do it in front of you since you're wearing a black shirt.
Here you go.